This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
I'm Emma Keeling, finding out what our COVID-19 futures might look like if the virus is here to stay.
And I'm Frankie McCamley in Cambridge to find out about a revolutionary microscopy technique.
Mass vaccination programs for COVID-19 are continuing around the world. I'm on my way to get my first jab this morning. Yeah, seriously. But not every country can afford vaccines or can gain access to supplies, and many are not following public health measures. We're not sure why we're seeing more young people being hospitalised in America and Brazil. And in India, hospitals in many cities have run out of beds, with people even turning to the black market for essential medicines and oxygen cylinders. And we still don't have a clear picture of how well the current vaccines will block disease and if they will affect transmission.
Okay, girl.
Done.
You're done. Yeah.
Just like that.
Yeah.
So what's the future going to look like? I asked virologist Dr. Jeremy Rossman, whom we've kept in contact with throughout the pandemic. So Jeremy, is the SARS-CoV-2 virus here to stay?
Globally, yes, at least for the foreseeable future. But locally, it's possible to eliminate the virus. So we have two words that we typically use. We use elimination and eradication. And eradication is the sort of global elimination of COVID, and elimination is what can happen locally. So locally, absolutely, and we have good examples of countries and areas having already eliminated the virus. But globally, it's still going to be around, which means that even countries that have eliminated it have the chance that the virus will come back and they will have to repeat the process.
If the virus is not eradicated, it will become endemic, where it will continue to circulate the globe, with breakouts popping up over many years. We still don't know what immunity people will acquire through infection or vaccination, but that doesn't necessarily mean deaths and social isolation will continue at the levels seen so far. What will our future look like if the virus stays?
First of all, we don't really know what's going to happen because the virus is going to continue to change. And the more infections that there are globally, the faster the virus is going to be able to change and adapt.
And we've seen that already, with multiple new variants undermining successful responses. In Chile, despite having vaccinated faster than any other country in the Americas, with more than a third of the country having had at least one shot, cases have soared and lockdown measures are back in place. South Korea's public health management and stringent contact tracing early in the pandemic was admired, but there are real concerns a fourth wave is imminent. To understand what might happen in the future, Dr. Rossman points to two common endemic viruses circulating the globe.
So measles virus is incredibly contagious, even more contagious than the COVID virus. But we have a very good vaccine, and we've worked on getting cases incredibly low and eliminating measles virus from countries for many, many years. And so most countries have eliminated measles virus, but they occasionally have outbreaks because there is still measles virus in the world. So we haven't eradicated the virus, but we have eliminated it. And so that means everybody still gets vaccinated for measles virus. Now, in contrast, we have flu. And flu, we have a lot of cases worldwide every year, and the flu virus evolves pretty quickly. So this is why we constantly need a new flu jab. So we don't have a constant flu circulating in the country. We have seasonal epidemics. So what we're probably looking at is somewhere in between the two, depending on how strong we act. So if we act really strong, we might be able to get to elimination, like with measles virus. And then we just have to constantly, look and say, do we need booster vaccines? Do we need to, do constant surveillance to look for those little outbreaks and then respond? But for the most people in the majority of the country, it would be pretty much life as normal outside of an occasional booster jab. Now, if we don't get that case numbers down quite so much, then it might be more like flu, where we get a lot of cases probably in the winter.
Dr. Rossman was shocked more countries suppress the SARS-CoV-2 virus rather than try to eliminate it. New Zealand decided to follow the elimination strategy and has had just over 2,500 cases and only 26 deaths. And one of the scientists who advocated going into lockdown early was this man, Professor Michael Baker, an epidemiologist who's part of the Pandemic Influenza Technical Advisory Group for the New Zealand Ministry of Health.
By the end of February, there was this remarkable report, and it was the WHO, a joint mission from them and China, that actually identified the fact that the virus had been stopped and contained in Wuhan. And this was really quite a remarkable event because pandemic diseases had not been stopped in this way before, not an intense respiratory pandemic like this. So that convinced me that actually we should be really looking at elimination. I actually assumed that the whole Western world would do that because the WHO team had identified that containment was possible and had been achieved in China.
Professor Baker says modelling showed that if left unchecked in New Zealand, the virus would have resulted in 12,000 to 13,000 deaths over 6 months or more in a population of almost 5 million.
There was this day really on the Monday, the 23rd of March, when the Prime Minister spoke to the nation and said, we are going to go to our highest level of containment as quickly as we can.
As of midnight Sunday, every person entering New Zealand, including returning New Zealand citizens and residents, will be required to enter self-isolation for 14 days.
The entire country was in an intense lockdown, and we spent 5 weeks in that lockdown and then 2 weeks in a lower level. It was a 4-tier system, so level 4 and then level 3 for a total of 7 weeks, and we emerged into a virus-free country.
Key strategies were border management, where all arrivals went into 2-week quarantine and still do. Later there was a use of masks, and that gave time to build up contact tracing. In the UK, in the early stages of the pandemic, officials decided to suppress rather than eliminate the virus, citing reasons including economic concerns. But Professor Baker says lives and the economy are intrinsically linked.
We analysed really a year of data from across the globe, published a paper in the British Medical Journal just before Christmas, and our conclusion was that actually elimination or containment, not only did it protect public health, it also protected economies, because what it does is it gives some certainty for business and other activities to resume. So countries pursuing elimination have 100 times fewer deaths typically, but they also have a much less economic contraction. And in fact, some countries pursuing elimination have got net economic growth last year, and the economy is now recovering very well. And even in New Zealand and Australia, which are also pursuing elimination, we are experiencing much better economic activity compared with countries that are trying to live with the virus.
While New Zealand has been in and out of lockdown to contain small outbreaks, life has returned to normal. It's also been able to open a travel bubble with Australia. Globally, there's been a lot of discussion about implementing COVID-19 passports to prove you've had the vaccination before international travel. This already exists for diseases such as yellow fever, where certain countries require a proof of vaccination before entry is permitted. So Michael, if I can prove I've had the vaccine, will I be able to come home and see my family without having to go into quarantine?
I think there's a reasonable chance of that. Again, it just depends. We need to know more about how well the vaccine performs. But I think once vaccine coverage is at a very high level, and once we manage transmission across borders, not with quarantine, but with vaccination and potentially testing, we could get to the point where we really didn't need public health measures for this virus anymore.
New Zealand now has the luxury of rolling out the vaccine slowly, but hopes to have the entire population of 5 million inoculated by the end of the year. Because so few have had the virus in New Zealand, which means there's less immunity, will they be more susceptible in winter, which is fast approaching?
No, they're not going to be at a greater risk because they don't have that immunity in the population. They are going to constantly be at risk of small outbreaks that hopefully they can continue to respond to very effectively as they've been doing. Now, there is a chance New Zealand in their winter that cases will rise a little bit, that they're going to be at a little bit more of a risk because we are seeing more transmission in the winter. But again, it's the same thing that we've seen before, is that focused on elimination, then they can spot those cases quickly, they can respond well, and as long as they keep doing it, they'll still have little outbreaks, but they can still keep the virus overall eliminated.
While infections continue to rise, the virus is still considered to be in the pandemic phase. To become endemic, infections need to be constant over the years. But to reach that stage will depend on how quickly populations develop immunity, and that is unknown when each country has a different strategy.
So I and many other people are advocating for an elimination strategy because it helps protect lives and economics. It's costly up front, but overall, it's less of a cost and allows us to get back to some version of normal quicker.
You can see more of Razor on our YouTube channel. Search for Razor Science Show and it will take you straight there. Remember to subscribe and hit the bell button for notifications.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN, see the difference. The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business, only on CGTN.
By 2040, it's likely that over half of all new cars will be electric. Already over 2 million electric vehicles are sold each year and rising. One problem with today's electric vehicles is that they use several different systems to charge. If you set off on a trip without compatible charging stations along your route, you could find yourself stranded. So-called range anxiety is a major barrier to electric car adoption. The race is on to produce batteries with ever longer ranges. But there's something on the horizon that could be a game changer for electric cars. Wireless charging. Based on a process called magnetic induction, an alternating current flows through a metal coil in a pad on the ground, creating a magnetic field. This generates current in a second coil on the vehicle, which is converted to direct current to recharge the battery. Power can be transferred over longer distances by setting the receiver and transmitter coils to resonate at the same frequency. It operates at 90 to 93% efficiency. That's comparable to plugging in. While a number of companies are innovating in this area, universal standards are being introduced for wireless charging, with the aim that one day the same system could work for all electric cars. Some car models are already available with cable-free charging, and the technology could be on a street near you by 2022. One development promising even more convenience is dynamic electric vehicle charging, topping up your battery on the go. In future, highways could include lanes with a series of coils embedded a few centimeters below the surface, which transmit energy to the vehicle's receiver. The system would calculate how much electricity each driver had used and bill them accordingly. With early trials showing promising results, it's a technology that could banish range anxiety for good.
Cryogenic electron microscopy, a technique for imaging biological molecules, has recently broken resolution records to enable visualization of individual atoms that make up proteins for the first time. I'm at the MRC Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge to find out more about the resolution revolution. Dr. Richard Henderson has dedicated his career to pushing the boundaries of structural biology.
The background in structural biology is that probably 1960, there were no detailed structures of biological molecules. That's all the enzymes, the muscle proteins, hemoglobin in the blood, and so on. The crystallographers who were having atoms and high resolution, they used to say, these electron microscopists, they're only looking at blobs. So we were called blobologists.
X-ray crystallography, the former dominant imaging technique, requires biological samples to be crystallized before images are created by bombarding them with X-rays. But many proteins don't survive the range of conditions needed to produce crystals. As a young biologist, Richard Henderson was frustrated by these limitations.
It was clear that there were many, many proteins in the membranes that are surrounding cells and that nothing was known about them. So I decided we needed to work on membrane proteins and try and work out all the methods that you needed to find out their structures. And probably 10 years, we didn't get any crystals suitable for X-ray diffraction. But it turns out electron microscopy allows you to look at much smaller individual molecules or very tiny crystals. It turned out cooling the specimen was quite useful, a factor of 5 or 6. And then it became clear, since you're taking images, you don't actually need to have a crystal because you can see the molecules.
Advances in hardware and software have both played a part in the resolution revolution. Sample structures that once looked like those blobs Richard mentioned were turned into highly detailed 3D shapes. In 2017, Richard and his colleagues Jacques Dubochet and Joachim Frank were awarded a Nobel Prize in chemistry for their work in developing this groundbreaking technique. How did it feel to win that Nobel Prize?
Well, they give several Nobel Prizes every year.
Oh.
There are apparently 900 people who have shared or won a Nobel Prize, and there are about 400 living Nobel Prize winners, and quite a few of them in Cambridge. So it's not so special. And even in this lab, There's about 15 or 16. Then they picked out 3 people to award it to, but it was really for the creation of the methodology in general. So it's a good thing for science, for scientists, for the Nobel Foundation, and then also in the world generally, because it's a way of picking out how progress is being made from year to year. So I think we're all great admirers of the Nobel Foundation and their actions.
Cryogenic electron microscopy, or CryoEM, needs very low temperatures. The imaging process begins by flash freezing protein samples using liquid nitrogen. Patricia Brown is part of the team that prepares the samples.
Hi, Patricia.
Hi.
Hello.
So I've got my sample ready. The protein's in the tube on ice right now, and what I'm going to do is we have these tiny little grids that are made of gold, and they have a surface with tiny little holes in them, which will then give us a very thin layer of vitreous ice.
An electric current is applied to this grid, creating a charge which will allow the protein sample to soak into tiny holes.
One freshly prepared grid.
The sample must be frozen almost as soon as it's applied to the grid, so the process is mechanised to keep it as cold as possible.
I gently apply the sample to the grid.
So you need a steady hand for this.
You need a steady hand for it.
The machine plunges the sample into liquid nitrogen, which creates the thin layer of ice necessary.
The sample has been made.
Hundreds of the same protein molecules are frozen between each section.
So now I need to transfer that tiny grid to my storage box. And there we go, first sample.
And how important is this step in CryoEM?
It's really very important. It's actually key, because if you don't get this right, then it doesn't matter how good your microscope is. If the sample's not good, you won't get good data out of it. So this is actually a really crucial step. Essentially, this allows us to, really get in there and have a look at something that we haven't been able to look at in the past using the tools we had back then. And now it allows us to just really have a look how things are ticking inside of us.
We've got our frozen sample now. What do we do next?
We're going to take it to the clipping station, clip the grids, and prepare them for CryoEM.
So this is where it all happens.
Welcome to the microscope.
Okay.
Should we have a look inside?
Absolutely. So this is the microscope.
This is where the magic happens.
This is huge. Wow. That is incredible. I've never seen a microscope that big.
Most of it is used for creating a vacuum and producing the electrons.
A vacuum is needed to remove any other atoms or molecules that could get in the way of electrons that are fired from an electron gun, which uses thermal energy as well as high voltages to accelerate the electrons. Before placing the sample in the machine, the fragile grid must be fitted into an O-ring so that the machine can grab it. Everything needs to be kept extremely cold or it will be unusable.
And what kind of temperature are we getting to here?
The temperature of liquid nitrogen is negative 196 degrees Celsius, I believe.
So a bit chilly.
Bit chilly, yeah. Gives us a big bubbling, and then now it's calming down a little. We'll then load the sample into a little nano cab.
Finally, the sample is placed in the microscope. The pre-prepared grid containing the pure protein molecules is now in place. A beam of electrons is generated and fired at the sample. They pass through the frozen protein molecules and are scattered by the atoms in the protein, creating an image on the electron detector. Georges Chairs has been working for more than a decade on the software development for this project.
So when we take a picture, there's now hundreds of copies of these individual molecules, which are a bit hard to see because the noise levels are so high. But if you squint your eyes a bit, you can see these little black dots, and I can put little green circles around them. So there's probably about 100 of them on this image. And each of them is a projection image of a copy of the same three-dimensional structure, but rotated in a different position. So you get two-dimensional views of a three-dimensional object from many different points of view, if you like. So our software then takes all these individual small images of these molecules and tries to determine which are these relative points of view of each of these images, and that then you can use that information to reconstruct the three-dimensional structure.
Resolution is usually reported in angstroms, or 1/10 billionth of a metre. In 2020, the software helped to reach the current record image of 1.2 angstroms. As the resolution gets down to measurements as small as this, it becomes possible to see individual atoms within a protein, achieving true atomic resolution. The structures in Shaw's recent visualization were so clear, the individual hydrogen and oxygen atoms of water were visible in the protein.
Richard actually happened to be in the corridor as well. We dragged him as well, and we looked at it and we said, oh wow, we could visualize this whole ordered structure, and then you can hopefully deduce how they function.
And why do we need to know that?
Proteins perform a wide range of functions of keeping you alive. Like nanoscale machines, they use movement of different parts in their functioning. So there's little proteins which have rotors, which are involved in energy creation, a bit like windmills or so, and there are proteins which use movements of arms, of levers, etc. So if you can understand the three-dimensional structure of these proteins, you can also study these processes when disease happens. And once you understand, you could then design drugs that target such molecules, hopefully to repair whatever went wrong in disease.
One way that these images are being used is in the hunt for a vaccine for COVID-19.
So this is coronavirus, yeah, these are 4 different copies. Did was to spike protein, so that's the little protrusions that you see here, and there's some close-ups here. And you can see this better perhaps here in a rendered view, which perhaps you've seen many of these on TV. I think the news broadcasters like them too. So this is the protein that the virus uses to bind to receptors inside your body. So this is the first contact between you and the virus. One thing that we found is that the spike can bend very strongly. So this could mean, for example, that your immune system could also recognize this little stalk that holds this trimer, the spike protein, to the virus surface. So those things might be important for vaccine development.
There are only a few CryoEM machines that can currently achieve the highest resolution, and these are very expensive. Richard is working on making the technique more accessible.
So what we need is just basically to know which of the features in the current CryoEM methodology are really important and which ones can be got rid of and then make it cheaper. Lots of people who are currently not doing CryoEM could greatly benefit from being able to do it without having to queue up to go to national centres or persuade their friend to do it for them.
The advances will allow structural biologists to map vast numbers of new proteins in greater detail than ever before. So has the resolution revolution reached its limit?
We're looking for bigger and better detectors. We're looking for perhaps slightly lower temperature freezing. We're only at liquid nitrogen, you can go lower. There are imaging methods that haven't been invented yet. You know, there are not an infinite number of structures to be determined, and we're probably halfway there in understanding the structure and atomic arrangement of most of the molecules, the big molecules in biology. You know, there'll be new complexes, there'll be new viruses, there'll be new drugs. But in the same way that in chemistry, you know, let's say in 1850, there was half a periodic table, and then say in 1920, you had a more or less complete periodic table. Biology is sort of more or less in the sort of 1850 for chemistry, and so in another 10 or 20 years, you'll have a more complete picture of most of the structures. We often say, what are the biological interesting questions that have not yet been answered? And I think that's the good thing about science. It's always new, so it's always exciting.
From blobology to perfectly rendered proteins, electron microscopy has come a very long way, and the technique will continue to improve, helping future generations to understand even more about the structures that build our biological world.